Welcome to Needham School Spotlight. I'm Dan Goody-Kanst, Superintendent of Schools. Student safety is a priority for the Needham schools and for the Needham Police Department. Joining me today to discuss how the schools and police collaborate to ensure student safety, well-being, and health are several folks who are involved in those efforts in the community. I want to welcome Ali Cooper-Argenteri, an assistant principal at the high school, athletic director Dan Lee, principal Aaron Seacott, school resource officer Ryan O'Leary, and police chief John Schlittler. Thanks to all of you for being here. Actually, before we begin, a couple of you are fairly new into your roles. Dan, you're starting as a new athletic director in Needham. What's a takeaway so far for you? How's it going?
Things are going great. The fall season is almost at its completion. The regular season ends for most teams this week. The kids have been doing great. We have a lot of success on and off the field, and looking forward to some postseason games coming up.
Good. Well, we're glad you're in this role.
Thank you.
Leading the troops and the charges. Officer O'Leary, you're kind of on the second year of this new responsibility, and I happened to see you yesterday at Elliott, leading some students in a workshop around the ALICE protocol. How's the work going in the Needham School so far?
Yeah, it's been great. It's been a great transition to working primarily with juveniles. It's allowed me to meet a lot of the kids and also a lot of the administrations throughout all the schools in town, but also get involved with different things throughout the community that pertains particularly to the juvenile age group.
Yeah, well, great. Well, it was neat to see you interact with the students, and he had some good moves with some of the students. I think we had some fourth graders you were working with at that time, yeah. and made some good connections with them. So, maybe if we can begin, Chief, with you and I have made an arrangement, a memorandum of understanding between our two departments. Can you describe for the community what's the purpose of the MOU and maybe some of the key features of it?
I think the biggest thing with the MOU is to open the lines of communication between the schools and the police department. I think historically in the past what has happened is that there was a lot of things going on at the school with individual students that we weren't aware of, but then there would also be things going on in the community with that same student that the school wasn't aware of. And the whole idea behind it is if we can keep those lines of communication open and we each know what's going on in the community and the schools, if we find that a student needs some help, that we're able to get that person the resources they need to help them with whatever situation's going on.
And what I like about us having this, the Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, is that it provides a structure and kind of defines some responsibilities. So it's not, anything goes, or an administrator is uncertain or unclear, or even a student or family. I mean, the intent is to provide that guidance, right, so that we can really have a strong partnership and relationship. Within the MOU, there's some information and detail, and by the way, the MOU is available on the school department's website. There is some information about our school resource officers. We're fortunate to be in a community that supports two school resource officers working with all of our students, as Officer O'Leary was just talking about. What do you see in general as the role of the school resource officer in the Needham schools?
Well, I think the biggest thing, obviously, the number one priority is school safety, but we also want to provide a safe, healthy, and nurturing environment for the children in the schools to learn, and that's the main thing, is they're there to learn. The SRO really is there to interact with students, have positive interactions, develop positive relationships with our students and our staff. And it's important to note that the school resource officers, they're also mentors and educators, and it's not an enforcement role, so the primary role of the police officer is not an enforcement. It really is establishing those positive relationships and communication and being a mentor to the students, not only in the elementary and middle schools, but at the high school as well.
Well, and as I said, I saw that in action yesterday with Officer O'Leary, who was working with the entire school, but in this case I saw him in a fourth grade classroom, and it was about education. It wasn't about enforcement. And there's a different message for students when a police officer is standing in front of them, engaging with them about what's important regarding their safety, than it is if a teachers do this regularly, of course, or if a principal does that. There's a different message conveyed, and I think it signals to our students that we're working together, and I think that's an important message. Aaron and Allie, when I think about the high school administration, you have a regular conversation and collaboration with the SRO in regards to student safety. What does that look like at the high school?
It can take a lot of different forms, but we are communicating almost daily with Vinny and now
So two school
Ryan.
resource officers, Vinny Springer
Yep,
and Officer O'Leary. Yep.
Vinny Springer and O'Leary, and we're communicating basically daily around different typically student safety concerns. The really nice piece is that the students get to know, both officers and feel comfortable with them and talking to them and sharing things with them and going to them as support and kind of getting ahead of things, which I've noticed, happen a few times where people are actually seeking out Vinny to discuss a potential problem or a situation that comes up. So we certainly view both Vinny and Ryan as allies in our work that we're doing to try to keep kids safe. And I think that the students feel the same way. And, I know that just their way and their demeanor with students is really appreciated with those kids and the families that they have to work with. And it's always about trying to find a good way through this to help the students learn, as opposed to just coming down really hard on students for mistakes.
What would you say
If I can
is...
add real quickly.
Yeah.
One of the nice parts about working in a district like Needham is whenever there's concern around a student, whether it's behavior or need for support, the response is a collaborative one. And so to have the school resource officers available, it brings a perspective and an expertise that we don't have on staff within the building to help make sure that we're looking at the complete picture of how best to support a student. So when we are thinking of creative ways to help problem solve whatever the issue may be, they're an integral resource in that conversation and really provide a perspective that we wouldn't get otherwise.
What would you say is having a police officer present on campus, not incidentally, but as part of the routine,
Mm-hmm.
what does it do to the culture? I mean, what would you say if you took the temperature of students in the presence of an officer on campus? Does it change things? Does it change the feeling at Needham High School?
Honestly, I think because of the actual relationships that are established, if we asked a student, found random students in the hallway and said, what do you think about having an officer on the campus? Many might not even realize we have an officer on campus, even though they know Officer Springer, and they think of him as Officer Springer, but they don't think of him as a police officer. He's just a member of the community and somebody who they have great relationships with. It would probably be a secondary understanding or realization before they're like, oh yeah, he's actually a police officer on force. But that highlights the relationships that are established. I mean, Officer Springer does a great job here in the high school, and I know Officer O'Leary does throughout the other buildings and levels. It's really those relationships that the chief had emphasized at the start of it that I think are most beneficial.
I would agree and say that it really is it's a positive culture, and at the same time, I think there is a peace of mind for staff, for students, and for families to know that there is a connection with the police department. There are times when a police officer may be needed to help support a family, to help support a student, and to know that the community and through the efforts of the police chief is sponsoring that resource in our schools I think sends a powerful message. Dan, I want to get a little bit to high school athletics. I know that I have been questioned in the past, perhaps a couple of you have been, by students and or parents about the relationship between student athletes and the police and our memorandum of understanding and how all of that works. We have an unbelievable athletic program, and the athletic program, most of it anyhow, is guided by the influence and the guidelines of the Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association, or the MIAA, specifically as it relates to the chemical health policy. So a couple of things, Dan. What's the chemical health policy? And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then I'd like to talk about how we enforce that policy.
So the MIAA, as you mentioned, they're the governing body for interscholastic athletics in Massachusetts. Their chemical health policy is consistent across every member school, and it's the baseline for what a school has to enforce. Schools could be more strict, they can't be more lenient. But for the chemical health policy, it's from the second Friday preceding Labor Day, which is when we can start practices and tryouts, through either the last day of school or the last tournament game of any sport, whatever's later, a student can't be found to consume or possess any alcoholic beverage, controlled substance, tobacco, and if they are, then they're subject to at first offense, a 25% suspension of their season, and then there are subsequent, greater penalties for further offenses.
I want you to be clear. Is this being involved with, for example, chewing tobacco or drinking a beer or smoking marijuana on campus?
No, it's if they're found to have been doing it anywhere within those time frames.
So 24/7, whether they're at home or they're away on vacation or they're at work or even on campus, there's a responsibility for you and for the high school administration to make sure that students are attending to, paying attention to that chemical health policy.
And it's not just for athletes in season either. It's
Okay.
for all students taking part in any of the athletic programs. So if a student is found to be in possession of something, let's say in the fall, and the sport that they really enjoy playing is the winter season, the penalty takes place in that winter season. So it's during that broad time frame that Dan outlined. It's not just when a student is actually in season.
So, okay, so let's back up a little bit about this. So I'm a spring sport athlete, and in the fall, I don't get a free pass. I can't, if you will, party or get involved with substances. You can't touch me, Mr. Athletic Director. I'm just in the fall, and I'm playing baseball or softball in the spring.
Right.
You can be involved and the policy can be enforced on you.
Right, and when Allie or the assistant principals get a report from the police, they'll reach out to us to see what students are athletes, and we'll cross-reference our database and see if they've played sports in the past or if they're incoming freshmen, if they've signed up to get more information, and so we put them into our database with a flag, so that if they were caught in the fall and they're playing a spring sport, then we would know that rule would have to be enforced in the spring.
I want to get to how. Go ahead.
Think about why. I think many parents would look at that from a punitive standpoint, and that's some of the feedback that we've heard. But you think about the governing body of sports in high schools across the state has made it very clear that tobacco, alcohol, other drugs are unhealthy, are in many cases illegal for students, but they're unhealthy. We are trying to make sure that collectively we're promoting healthy choices for all of our students. And so that's why it is across the board and throughout the year, and not just when you're performing that particular sport. It is an effort to make sure students are making great choices all the time.
So I appreciate you saying the why. I mean, what's the intent? The intent is overall to ensure student wellness and health, and also player and athlete safety.
Right.
Someone who's otherwise under the influence of something could be quite unsafe out on the ball field, for example. Overall, though, it's for student wellness and well-being and safety, and I think we get that. How though do you find out about what I'm doing on the weekend? I mean, and that gets to our work with the police department. How does that information come across your desk? It's Monday morning, you come back to work, and you're informed how that a student or students may have been at a party where there were substances present and they were involved in them. How does that happen?
Through the MOU, if the principals or assistant principals get something across their desk, then they'll reach out to the athletic department, and that's how it first comes across.
And how does it come across the desk? How would you find out, Ellie?
Typically in a written report.
From the police?
Yep, the Officer Springer brings into us and shares with us. And typically from that point, we read it, we get together as assistant principals and discuss. Often the reports involve multiple students. And since we share, the student body or have responsibility for different students, we work together in those situations. We would let Dan know and get him involved to see who are athletes, who are not. And for those students who are athletes, we typically would ask Dan or now Mike Jackson to be a part of the conversations and ultimately the investigation that we do to try to determine if anyone violated the policy.
So I want to ask you, Chief and Officer Larry, so what does that look like on the weekend? I mean, what you hear about a disturbance or a party? I mean, what might happen at your end so that this information comes to the school? What's a typical scenario if there is one?
Usually what happens is that we'll get a call from somebody in the neighborhood or a concerned parent that there might be an underage party going on. As a result of that information, we'll send an officer or a couple officers to the scene, and then the officers will go to the house, conduct whatever type of investigation. They'll document what happened in an incident report, and once the incident report has been documented and generated, then Officer Springer will bring that up to the school.
So at that time, their names would be collected, presumably, and then that, because of our memorandum of understanding,
Right.
that will be shared so that we can have a conversation about, in specific, those students who may be athletes, and therefore we're enforcing the chemical health policy. If I am an athlete and I've got a big game coming up, and yet I went to this party and I was standing there, but I was not involved in any of the, for example, drinking beer or alcohol, is the policy going to be enforced on me, or what happens? What if I'm a bystander, but I'm
Right.
not actively involved?
So the MIAA rule changed a while back to make it from in the presence of to in possession or consumption of. So through the course of the investigation, if it's found that a student athlete was there but was not in possession of or consuming alcohol, then they would not face a chemical health violation.
Those scenarios are opportunities to talk to the students about their choices, about being in those unsafe locations, being in positions where sometimes the decision-making gets taken out of their hands. You know, for instance, if they're at a party and sitting next to somebody who's consuming a drink and they say, hey, will you hold this for a second? And that's when the police officers walk in. Well, they're in possession at that point. And so not being in those scenarios is a far safer and smarter choice. We understand adolescents are social and sometimes will put themselves in those situations, but the policy and the thoughtfulness of the investigations can help to differentiate those who are involved and those who weren't. And that's where I think it's also worth highlighting real quickly that we tend to think of the MOU and MIA as being intricately linked, and there certainly is a clear connection, as you're hearing from Dan and others. But there are also students who will come in on a Monday morning and say, hey, coach, I made a really bad choice. And that invokes the MIA policy, but has nothing to do with the MOU. Or there are times where students may get together and we hear from students or parents, and we deal with an investigation that never even made it into the police officer's understanding. So the MIA policy governs all, and much of that comes through the MOU and the relationship and communication we have, but it's not the only way that we get some of that information and have to take some steps with students to support them.
That's an important point to make, because it is not, so what you're saying is we do not necessarily always lean on the police to enforce our school policies or MIA. Students and families and staff sometimes work together to resolve that.
Correct.
The police aren't looking for any of these problems, is that correct?
Yeah, for the most part, we're not.
You're not? Okay.
Yeah,
I think you have enough to do,
right,
so.
it is, but we do occasionally, officers in patrol will pull up to a location, whether it be at a school or someplace in town where kids kind of congregate, and they'll issue a rise from that. But it's important to know that we're not out there looking for any punitive action towards the students. Same with the MIAA and the MOU. The whole idea is to keep our kids safe, and it takes a community to do that, whether the police, the schools, all our other health-related resources too. So it's a combined effort to do that, and I think it's not punitive, and that's a big thing.
Officer O'Leary, I'm sure you've had the experience where you've been called to one of these situations, and so what's the reaction when they see you, because they are getting to know you, and certainly Officer Springer. What happens? How does that work?
Well, even to the point of bringing the report into the schools, a lot of the times the schools have heard about this, whether it's through word of mouth, whether it's through
Social media, perhaps?
Social media.
Yeah.
A lot of the times they've already heard about it, they're already trying to take action on it, so the fact that there was a police officer there who wrote a report, documented what they saw, it helps to, if there's some rumor spreading or if there's somebody who's innocent who wasn't there, it's nice for there to be a written report generated so that we can share that with the schools, so that what they're hearing, they can also hear it from somebody, a police officer who was on scene. As far as showing up to these types of events, that's just another thing now that it helps being in the schools every day, and you get to see kids and you know which student's going to react a certain way. You can talk to them. You have a rapport with certain students that you can talk to them, and in my experience, it's helped with getting to the bottom of it. Instead of them thinking of the police as the authority figure where they're going to get in trouble if they talk to us, maybe they have a concern that they normally wouldn't voice in that moment, but if they see Officer Springer or they see me, somebody that they see every day, they'll come up to you and they'll talk to us, and we have that rapport with them that we can kind of get the truth and get the communication flowing.
Well, and the other thing is that I've seen in your role is that there's an opportunity, if you are concerned about somebody you've seen in the community, to share with an assistant principal or with the principal or a guidance counselor, just so you know, I've seen this or heard about this. So that's an opportunity for the school, as appropriate, to intercede. It doesn't mean we get involved in everyone's business. We can't, but there might be an opportunity to have a conversation for Allie to pull someone aside to say, hey, I've heard about this and concerned about this. How can I help you? How do we educate students about this chemical health policy and the aftermath if you are in violation of the policy? I mean, what do we do? Do they learn about this? Are there programs about it? How do they learn about it? How do student athletes and their families learn about it, Dan?
So we have athletic information nights for all 9th and 11th grade student athletes and their parents every year. We have one in August, and then we have one coming up. The 15th of November is our next one. And during those information nights, we go through all of our athletic policies, but we carve out a portion where one of the assistant principals will come and talk about the MOU and the role of the police department with the schools. And then we talk about the chemical health policy. We lay it out for them. We talk about the consequences. I try to stress we hope that obviously this never becomes an issue. But the thing we try to get across is it's a choice to play sports for Needham High School. And if you do, then you have to abide by the rules of the MIAA and the school. So through our athletic info nights, we have coaches meetings every year, and we go over that information with our coaches to reiterate that to their student athletes. We get that information out to the student athletes and their parents. It's listed in our handbook, which is also available on the athletics website. So twice a year through all of so the student athletes and their families, if they start in 9th grade, will come to an info night twice in their athletic career. And that's where we try to drive that point home and sort of talk about those issues. And then, we'll work with the coaches again to hammer that point home. And as Aaron brought up earlier, for a student who is found to have not been in violation of the chemical health policy but was in a tough situation, that's when we like to try to work with the student athletes and their coaches to talk about making good decisions when they're in season and when they're out of season.
It is exceptionally rare that a student doesn't understand the policy. They know what the impact is. It's been, I think, pretty clearly communicated across the board, and they know that if they're caught with any of these things, there's going to be some consequence for it. That lack of surprise is indication of the communication that's happening pretty readily. And I think it's also important to note that it's not just about our athletes. We have a chemical health policy that impacts participation in non-athletic endeavors
Let's talk
as well.
about that for a moment. The MIAA is, I believe, and Aaron, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, it's really the only outside organization that can govern a consequence for our students, I think.
It's really the only policy that we have that's established by an outside organization.
An outside organization, okay.
And so
what does Needham High School have
years
beyond
ago,
that?
there was concern that our athletes are being targeted with a consequence, but those who are involved in musicals and clubs and other activities weren't. We've since gone through a couple different iterations of our own chemical health policy, but for the same reasons. We want to make sure our students are making good choices, that we are providing whatever incentives we possibly can to deter poor choices, and that everybody understands that participation in after-school activities, whether it's athletics or not, is a privilege and an option that we can provide for students, but it's not an automatic right. So we're going to do what we can to encourage those good choices by enticing the participation. We do have a little bit more flexibility with our own chemical health requirements because it's not established by the MIAA, but we're constantly thoughtfully addressing those. And because it's not just about athletics, we also communicate this in a variety of forums. At the beginning of the year, we have a night dedicated to our parents of 9th graders and another night dedicated to 10th and 11th grade parents. And in both those nights, one of the sessions that parents could choose from was focused on chemical health. so that they had a clear understanding of what the impact could be. And that's one of many different ways that, and different forms that we try and provide this information. I've done parent coffees talking about the details of all of this. We have, every other year, we have parent conferences where parents are invited to come in on Saturdays, put on by the PTC with a series of workshops, and chemical health is always a topic that we address there. So we're trying to make sure it's as informed as
It
possible.
seems like there's a lot of communication around it, and yet, you know, when it happens to you, then it's surprising and catches people off guard. So, you know, Allie and all of you really, and Chief, so what are parents saying? So I can imagine, you know, the athletes, you said something a moment ago, they know that this is part of the routine. I mean, it's been around for a long time. I've been in Massachusetts education for well over 20 years, and its policy's been there in one form or another, so it's not a new thing. But what about parents? What do parents say to you or to Officer O'Leary when all of a sudden they're caught up in this?
You know, I think the biggest thing with parents is that, and in some cases it's true, consistency with the way that, you know, the MOU is and how we respond to certain incidents. But I often tell them, listen, our offices have a little bit of discretion. We do have a zero tolerance policy within our police department and how to handle underage parties or incidents. In some cases, the officers have a little bit of discretion how they handle it. Every case is not black and white. So there has to be a little bit of movement for the officer. So I think a lot of times parents will come in and they'll say that they're, you know, this person last week, this didn't happen and so forth. And we just try and remain as consistent as we can, but there are going to be cases where the result is a little bit different from other ones.
Right. Well, there's no question that there's an overarching goal that all of you are focused on, and it's going to be imperfectly enforced. There's going to be that human factor that might impact it. I'm pleased, though, that it's clear that all of you and the other administrators are working together and communicating a lot with folks to try to explain what the rules are and how it impacts them at school. The other part of the rule, too, by the way, has to do with grades, right? This isn't just about chemical health, but I believe athletes are also held to this other standard that they have to have, what's the rule around the grades? I forget.
For Needham High School, they need to be passing a minimum of 5 courses and can't have more than 1 fail or incomplete.
So there's that standard as well, too.
Which we're above the
You're above
minimum.
that minimum. And that's
Right.
the more strict guidelines
Right.
than otherwise other schools may or may not have. Well, as I'm listening to this conversation, I think there are at least 3 takeaways for me. One, student health and safety is a priority to the Needham Police Department and clearly to the school department, and is a big part of our athletic program. Whether it's from concussions and concussion safety to chemical health, we really want to make sure our students stay healthy and safe. The other takeaway is that the schools and police are collaborating a lot. Your presence here is an indication of that, and the Memorandum of Understanding really helps codify what we're trying to do, what we aspire to do, even if it isn't perfectly, and I think therefore it's an important guide for the community and for folks to understand. And then lastly, a takeaway from me, you've all talked about, is education over enforcement really is the preference. That we're really trying to work with young people, whether it's talking about ALICE and safety protocols in the 4th grade, or chemical health and safety and driving, another layer to all of this in high school. We want to educate our students and work with them rather than come down on them, although that will happen depending on the circumstances. So I think even though there might be a consequence, we hope there's always learning from that consequence. So I appreciate this conversation, and I'm hoping it can help spread some of the information about what we're trying to do. I would encourage folks to go to the Needham Public Schools website under the superintendent's page to see a copy of the Memorandum of Understanding, and also the high school athletic handbook and other information about the MIA is available on the high school athletic website. Thanks very much, folks, for the conversation today. Appreciate it.